Senator Dodson, I'll start with you. You've been a strong proponent of reconciliation, and many still refer to you as the father of reconciliation. You're not the grandfather of reconciliation yet. Now, as we launch the 7th barometer of attitudes towards reconciliation today, what are some of your key reflections on where we are today compared with the Australia of 30 years ago?
Obviously, the big difference is the Uluru statement from the heart, calling for a voice to the Parliament, for a Makarrata Commission to set up a treaty-making process, and for a truth-telling process. And when we started the reconciliation process, you would have been probably drummed out of town if you mentioned the word treaty. So we have come a long way in terms of not being afraid of the terminology, not being afraid of having the discussion. We are a bit cautious about the consequences, but we are going down the path towards a referendum on the first step of that. A long way from trying to build an understanding base for why reconciliation was an important concept and the need for us to get together so that we could, in fact, face up to these very challenging prospects that lie ahead of us.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Thorpe, now we've seen some positive results across a number of measures in this report, but sadly experiences of racism continue to rise, with over 60% of First Nations peoples experiencing racism in the last 6 months alone. What needs to be done to start to turn this around?
Well, we need leadership in this space from the government. We need to ensure that our people are safe out there, and we've seen recently our children being targeted without consequence. There are a number of measures that we could take to address racism in this country, and I think that we need an appetite from the government to ensure that racism is not acceptable, but there are consequences for being a racist. Unfortunately, even in this place, we have racists that are allowed to be racist. It's actually you're allowed to be a racist in the chamber. It's part of the program in this place. So if it's part of the program in this place, then we're not really setting a good example in terms of leadership. So I think we all have a responsibility to play in addressing racism in this country. Our children should be free to go to school and not feel unsafe. And we need all sporting codes, we need all businesses. It's everybody's collective responsibility across this country. And it's not an Aboriginal issue. It's a white Australia issue that started 200 years ago. So we need to know the truth, understand the truth, stand with us and call it out. It's not called out in the chamber. It's allowed to go ahead. So we need real leadership in this space, and we need you to stand with us.
Thank you, Senator Thorpe. Naomi, if I can come to you now. We've seen a strong message in this report that businesses and the corporate sector should be doing more to help to close the gap and do more to actually progress reconciliation. From your perspective, what do genuine partnerships with First Nations people and business actually look like?
Thanks, Peter. What do genuine partnerships look like? I think first and foremost, for us, it means putting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander team members and customers at the heart of how we take our businesses forward. That's what a partnership is. I think one of the, have the honour of working at Wesfarmers, and one of our incredible assets is our team member base. We employ 120,000 people, 110,000 here in Australia, and driving employment, driving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment, not just at scale and proportionally represented across all our wonderful businesses like Bunnings and Kmart, but making sure that we go from good to great in that regard. We need proportional representation top to bottom, and to do that we need to listen and we need to invest. And there are lots of different ways that you can do that. It's about local place-based relationships. It's about investing in culturally strong and appropriate leadership development programs. We love our relationship with the AILC here in Canberra, led by Robin Forrester. Those kinds of measures are what we would regard as investments building a culturally competent and strong Australian organisation. The other asset, though, that we have is representation all over this great country, in every state and in every territory, in every major city and in every regional city as well. And so one of the wonderful things that enables you to do is to really invest in those regions, those cities, those towns where there's so much more work to be done. And you know, I'm a massive fan, I hope everyone in the room is, of Kmart. It's like one of the greatest stores in Australia, I think. But their Deadly Stores program is just one of the most amazing initiatives in the group, and it's taking it's taking our investment into places like Karratha and Shepparton and everywhere in between, and investing in competence in our team members, accelerating our employment of young and mature Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And what we see, whether it be those kinds of measures or many of the other ones in bringing Aboriginal suppliers into our stores as well, is that by building stronger, more resilient, more competent and more connected to the community businesses, our businesses also thrive. It's great for the community, it's great for our relationships and our team members, but it's also great for our businesses. So there's definitely a role, absolutely a role for corporate Australia.
Thank you, Naomi, and 100% right. Kmart, love Kmart. If you've got kids, shopping at Kmart at 9 o'clock at night is one of the best things ever. Peace and quiet and the ability to shop. But thank you. Thank you for sharing insights about business and corporates and partnerships. Catherine Snake, of course, is the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and you launched a very important report yesterday. Mm-hmm. What does a reconciled Australia look like in the future for all our children to thrive and actually fulfil their potential?
Yeah, you know, is this one working? Awesome. I've got a really soft voice. I'm always conscious of that. Look, I might start with the data, and I know that it's something that Karen mentioned. That report yesterday showed that more than 22,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are currently living in out-of-home care, and that number has increased from the year before. I think it's a 10.4, from 10% to 10.4. The number of those children now living with families that, or in institutions that aren't Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander families or aren't Aboriginal community controlled, has also gone up. These numbers just keep escalating. We also know when we look at that data that only 16% of the 22,000, and again a reminder, this is the number increasing, will actually ever be reunified with their families. So that's children that won't get to know their brothers and sisters. That's children that don't get to know their mums and dads, their aunties and uncles, their grandparents. They don't get to sleep in their own beds. And there's a lot of assumptions about why our children end up in out-of-home care, and it's usually that there's something seriously wrong with their families, but that's not what the data tells us. If you understand the data, if you allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to interpret that data, what they'll tell you is those stats are all talking about neglect, and that speaks to what Senator Thorpe was saying, and that is a level of racism and understanding that what other people understand as neglect is actually poverty. And that poverty is a result of a failure of systems and processes and practices and policies and KPIs. And a lot of them started in this building right here. This is where the decisions and the enablers are made. So when we look at what a reconciled future for our children would look like, I think it's when the policies, the laws, The programs, the practices that determine how we shape the lives of our children aren't made here, but rather that autonomy is given back to our families and to our communities and to those people who know what's actually happening on the ground. When I think about even just at this point in time, as we've come into this conversation, every single Aboriginal person that has spoken mentioned children. I wonder how many other rooms we go into where every single speaker mentions the importance of children. And again, if I root it into the current conversation, when we look at the Uluru Statement and it references the horrific number of child removals in Australia, it states quite simply, this cannot be because we do not love our children. So what I'd like to see in a reconciled Australia, one that acknowledges that, is that our children understand that they belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. No other children in the world can say that. We belong to the culture that understood how to care for children, that placed children at the heart of everything we do. We belong to the culture that had grandmother's law centuries before we had a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, centuries before we needed a child protection system, that they know that they can access services, they know that they can go to school, they know that they can thrive, they know that they can walk into buildings like this and not be afraid of what they're looking at, because in actual fact, this is built on your country, and when you walk into this country, you can, like our Paul did here, talk in your language, the language that belongs to this land, the language that resonates with the leaves and the land and the lakes and the birds and all of those things, and they stand here and they feel proud, and everyone in Australia talks about the importance of children. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for your work, but also the work of Snake in continuing to be our national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Senator Dodson, speaking of voice, the government's committed to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, it has a broad agenda on closing the gap and has committed to a national anti-racism framework. What impact will progress in these areas have on the lives of First Nations people in this country?
Well, hello? Yes. The impact obviously will be when there's a voice to this Parliament that will constantly advocate for the change that people require. As politicians, you can hear these bells go. There's a different bill or a different proposition in a bill that's being voted on. Now, that will pass and we'll move on to the next thing. These reports that we've had will go to a voice, and they'll be able to systematically, constantly and persistently say to this Parliament, you are not doing good enough. You're not doing well enough. And this is what we think you ought to do. Pick up what Senator Thorpe said, show some leadership on the racism question. Do something about the wraparound services required for the families so that they are supported. Help the men, the Aboriginal men in this country, to stop the violence against women and children and stop the violence within our communities. And these are the ways we want you to do it. Now, they are very sensitive issues, but they will be advocated by a voice to this Parliament, by the leaders and representatives from the communities at every level. And that'll get the change.
Senator Thorpe, we heard Senator Thorpe, we heard Karen outline some of the data in the barometer, and there's strong support for a voice, treaty and truth, and there's also strong support for more action on closing the gap. Positive developments, they're all positive developments for reconciliation. What do you think that says about how we're tracking and where we need to focus in coming years?
Well, I think it starts with a war that was declared on us over 200 years ago. That war has never ended. You've got the reports, you've got the statistics. They've been going on for 200 years. When the invaders come here, there was no agreement to them staying here. And that's why we need a treaty. A treaty is an end to the war. We are one of only a few Commonwealth countries in the world that does not have a treaty with First People here. If we look at Waitangi, we can have extra 9 Senate seats in the Parliament with real power rather than an advisory group which has parliamentary supremacy over it at all times, that can provide advice to the Parliament, where the Parliament, and I tell you what, I've been here long enough to know that the Parliament really decides whether they take your advice or not. Treaty will bring real power to our people. 9 Senate seats in the Senate. It will bring us to an equal power level, sovereign, to sort out this country. Never been done in the history of this country. We've tried everything. Advisory groups, ministerial advisory groups. How many of our people have to sit and advise the government? Well, I think we're better than that today. And I think that if you look at the barometer, this country is ready for a treaty. Treaty is back on the table, and that's what I'll be focusing on, and that's what I know many blackfellas around this country want: an end to the war, an end to the incarceration rates, the removal rates. The removal rates of children in this country is an act of genocide. Genocide. And when you mention genocide in the chamber, people hold on to their, chests and say, what? No, you can't say that word, genocide. Well, the fact is, genocide is continuing through stealing children from their families. A treaty is an end to the war that will genuinely address all of those issues, because we'll be at equal power level with the colonisers that have hurt us for so long.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. We're fast coming up to the end of our duration of this panel talk, so I might just whip around for one last short response. And I'll start with you, Naomi. The 2022 Australian Reconciliation Barometer provides clear evidence that Australians are really eager for change and they want a more united and cohesive nation. And I'll ask this of all the panel. What's the one thing in your area you think you could do to advance this right now, to make change and make a more united, cohesive nation?
One thing. I think lots of things will be required, but to focus on one, we saw in the barometer the importance of relationships, and if Indigenous people are known to non-Indigenous people, then trust increases, understanding increases. For us, one thing that we will be investing in incredibly heavily over the next couple of years is building more culturally competent workforces, knowing that they have the opportunity to take that competency home to their families, and also to bring that competency to the 10 million Australians a week who pass through our stores. So we Reconciliation Australia and Karen and her terrific team held our feet to the fire on this, and over the next 2.5 years, we'll implement 120,000 instances of cultural awareness training across the country. So there's one thing. 120,000 things, actually.
Thank you. Catherine, what's the one thing in your area that you'll do?
Oh, man. Yeah, I don't think there is one thing, to be perfectly honest. No way there's one thing. There is so much to be done. And I'm going to be a little bit naughty, actually, because I'm going to make a couple of people feel uncomfortable, because I think we do need to bounce a little bit off what Lidia said. Those terminology, those words like colonisation, like genocide, like invaders, like war, if they make you uncomfortable, I think that's the one thing I need to do is back those things in and understand that when we work with you, when we hear things like child removals, when we see statistics, when we hear things like racism, we feel as equally as uncomfortable as other people do when you hear that language, except that those things genuinely impact on us. So the one thing I can do is continue to come into these spaces, continue to have these conversations, continue to raise the profile of children, and continue to work with governments, with partners, with allies to say, okay, how do we do this differently? How do we be braver? And how do we create a society when we no longer have to be scared of any of those words because they don't hurt any of us?
Thank you very much. Senator Thorpe?
Well, I'm here to protect our sovereignty as First Nations people. That's my mandate, and I don't want this place to ever put our sovereignty as First Nations people at risk in this country. That's why treaty is a position of shared sovereignty. That's why it's important. That's what will give us self-determination, and that's what will self-empower our clans, nations and families right across this country, because they will be at the table, not the hand-picked people. We need the grassroots families that are struggling, that don't get a look in, don't get a seat at the table, and we need to protect our sovereignty. So that goes with a treaty, a peace treaty in this country.
Thank you. Senator Dodson, what's the one thing in your area that you think you could do to advance, change and make a more united and cohesive nation?
Well, the one thing is contained in two statements. Michael Long went on the long walk from Melbourne to here and asked John Howard, "Where's the love for my people?" Noel Pearson, in his first Boyer lecture, said, "We must be the most unloved people in this country." So to me, where's the love? How the love will grow? A positive response to the referendum for a voice. The other matters of treaty and the substance of treaty making can be followed, and they will be. We are committed as a government to those matters. But the first thing is, where's the love for our people? And let's get it expressed, because that's what interacts on the day-to-day basis, where people are encountering each other or not even bothering to respect each other.
Thank you, Senator Dodson, and thank you all for highlighting your passions and your determination in your respective fields and sectors to advance both reconciliation to creating a more united nation.